Welcome back to the deep dive. It is Monday, February 23rd, 2026.
Sure is.
And, if you're checking your calendar this morning, you probably just see a standard start to the work week.
Yeah, maybe a few meetings, a gym session if you're ambitious.
Right, exactly. But the sources we've pulled for today suggest that this specific date, February 23rd, isn't just a random Monday on the grid.
It definitely isn't. When you really stack up the historical record, this date acts almost like a core sample of a very specific global struggle.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We are looking at a timeline that stretches all the way from the 18th century Caribbean to apartheid-era South Africa, through American Reconstruction, and then eventually landing right in the power centers of 1960s New York.
And the through line here is not subtle at all. Our mission today is to track the architecture of Black liberation and power.
But what's really interesting to me, at least in the sources, is how the actual nature of that power shifts on this exact date across the centuries. We aren't just looking at 5 different protests or something.
Right.
We're seeing an evolution of strategy.
That is the key right there. We move from the raw kinetic energy of armed revolt to the cold bureaucracy of settler independence, and then into the high theory of sociology, the fragility of constitutional law, and finally into actual executive command.
It's basically a progression from burning the plantation to running the borough.
I mean, that's one way to put it, yeah.
We have so much ground to cover. So let's just get right into the first layer of this sediment. We are going back to February 23rd, 1763.
Okay.
To the Dutch colony of Berbice.
Which is in modern-day Guyana, for anyone trying to place it on a map.
Right, modern-day Guyana.
Yeah.
And, most people probably know about the Haitian Revolution in 1791.
Sure, that's the famous one.
But the Berbice slave uprising happened nearly 30 years before that. And looking at the logs from our sources, this wasn't just some spontaneous riot. This was a highly coordinated military offensive.
It was incredibly sophisticated. It started on plantations along the Conge River. And the leader, his name was Cuffy or Kofi, depending on the translation you're reading. He was an Akan man, likely from modern-day Ghana. And you have to understand, the Akan people had a really strong military tradition.
They weren't just farmers.
Exactly. So Cuffy didn't just tell people to, run into the jungle and hide. He actually organized them into strict combat units.
I was reading through the correspondence from the Dutch governor, Wilfred Simon van Hugenheim, and you can practically smell the panic in the ink of these letters.
Oh, he was terrified.
By the time February 23rd rolls around, the uprising is in full swing, and the Dutch are realizing that they're completely outmatched here. They're retreating to the coast and just abandoning the interior entirely.
Because the numbers were just overwhelming. I mean, there were about 350 white colonists and nearly 4,000 enslaved people.
Wow.
So once the sheer discipline of the plantation system broke, the whole colonial infrastructure just collapsed almost instantly.
Yeah.
But what makes Cuffy really fascinating to me is what he does after that initial wave of violence. He doesn't just want to kill the Dutch or drive them into the sea. He actually wants to negotiate a geopolitical settlement.
Which is wild. He actually wrote letters to the governor, didn't he?
He did. He really did. And this is crucial for understanding our whole deep dive today. Cuffy sends a letter to Van Hugenheim proposing a formal partition.
Like drawing a border.
Yes. He essentially says, you keep the coast, we keep the interior, we'll trade with you, but we are a sovereign state now.
That is just a mind-blowing concept for 1763. He's not asking for better treatment on the plantation. He's proposing a literal 2-state solution in South America.
He was acting as a head of state. He declared himself the governor of the Negroes of Berbice. He established a whole system of production.
Even though that caused some issues, right?
Yeah, admittedly, it created some internal friction because he forced some people back to work to maintain the food supplies for the army. But the ambition there was pure statehood.
It really shatters that myth that enslaved people were just passively waiting for emancipation to be granted by some benevolent empire.
Exactly. This was a seizure of power.
Now, obviously, the uprising was eventually crushed after about a year due to internal infighting and massive European reinforcements coming in.
True, but for that 1 year, the colony essentially didn't exist. A Black Republic did.
Right.
And that psychological break terrorized the colonial powers everywhere in the Americas. It announced loud and clear that the plantation system was incredibly fragile.
So 1763 gives us this model of power seized through raw force and declared sovereignty. Now, I want to slide the timeline forward to our next February 23rd. This is 1854.
Okay, crossing the Atlantic.
Right, we're going to Southern Africa.
The Bloemfontein Convention.
Yes. And this is a really tricky one of the sources because, legally speaking, this is framed as an Independence Day. The British Empire signs a treaty recognizing the independence of the Orange Free State.
On paper.
Right on paper. If you just read the headline, it sounds like a classic story of decolonization. Plucky settlers throwing off the British yoke.
But the devil is entirely in the demographics here. This was really just the British formally washing their hands of the interior and handing over sovereignty entirely to the Boers, the Dutch-descended settlers.
So it's independence for the white man.
Yes, but for the Basotho people and the other indigenous African groups in the region, it was the slamming of the door. It was the opposite of liberation.
The context here is a massive power vacuum.
Yeah.
The British have been fighting these incredibly expensive border wars with the Basotho king, Moshoeshoe I.
Who was a brilliant military strategist and diplomat back then.
Absolutely brilliant. And the British eventually just looked at the ledger and decided, this is too costly, let the Boers handle it.
And handle it is a very dark euphemism in this context. By signing the Bloemfontein Convention, the British essentially removed the only imperial check on Boer expansion.
They just let them off the leash?
Pretty much. The Boers immediately established a republic based on a constitution called the Grondwet. And this document explicitly stated that there would be no equality between white and non-white inhabitants in either church or state.
So if Berbice in 1763 was about people breaking their chains, February 23rd, 1854 is about welding them shut using a legal constitution.
That's a great way to put it. It formalized the racial hierarchy.
It industrialized it, really. Before this treaty, the frontier was certainly violent, but it was chaotic.
Right.
After this, dispossession became highly bureaucratic.
You needed passes, you lost your land rights, you couldn't vote. This is the direct chain connection to apartheid. The Orange Free State became the ideological laboratory for the hardline racial policies that would eventually dominate all of South Africa in the 20th century.
It's just a sobering reminder for anyone reading history that independence is a completely neutral term. It depends entirely on who is writing the Declaration.
And more importantly, who was forcibly excluded from the room when it's signed.
Which brings us perfectly to someone who spent his entire life analyzing exactly who was in the room and who was left out. Let's jump to February 23rd, 1868.
Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
The birth of William Edward Burgard Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois.
It is genuinely hard to overstate the monumental shift here in our timeline. We've had physical war in the jungles of Guyana. We've had diplomatic maneuvering in South Africa.
And now we have the birth of the intellect.
Yes. Dubois isn't just a participant in the struggle. He is the one who gave the world the vocabulary to actually understand it.
He's the cartographer of modern race relations. I mean, he was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, but his contribution goes so far beyond his academic credentials.
He looked at the post-slavery world, and remember, he is born just a few years after the American Civil War ends, and he asks a foundational question. How does this systemic oppression actually work on the human mind?
And this is where we get the concept of double consciousness. I think sometimes that term gets thrown around in introductory college seminars without people really feeling the actual weight of it.
It is a deeply visceral concept. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, he describes it as this profound sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. It's the inherent tension of being Black and being American. He called it two warring ideals in one dark body. But he didn't just frame this condition as a tragedy, he also called it a second sight.
Meaning that Black people essentially understood the white world better than white people did because they absolutely had to in order to survive it.
Precisely. And if you connect this back to our timeline, Cuffy down in Berbice a century earlier probably didn't have double consciousness.
No.
He had a very singular consciousness. I am an Akan warrior and you are my enemy. The Orange Free State in 1854 created the physical barriers and borders.
And then Du Bois comes along and maps the psychological landscape that those specific barriers created.
And he also operationalized that theory. He didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He helped found the NAACP. He edited the Crisis magazine for decades. He fundamentally understood that you couldn't just fight this with muskets anymore. You had to fight with data, with sociology, and with propaganda in the positive sense of the word.
He realized early on that the color line was global.
Yes, the problem of the 20th century.
And late in his life, he actually moves to Ghana, which closes the loop perfectly with Cuffy's Akan origins. He understood that the struggle in Mississippi was intrinsically linked to the struggle in Johannesburg.
He really was the architect of the Pan-African worldview.
Speaking of Mississippi, that is our next stop. And it is arguably the most heartbreaking pivot on this entire timeline. We are jumping forward to February 23rd, 1870.
Just 2 years after Du Bois is born.
Exactly. On this specific day, Mississippi is formally readmitted to the United States. Now, for any of you who might be a bit rusty on your Reconstruction history, Mississippi had obviously seceded.
They lost the war.
Right. So to get back into the Union, they had to agree to some very specific non-negotiable conditions.
They had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. And they had to ratify the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race.
And on paper, on February 23rd, 1870, they did it. In fact, Mississippi almost immediately sent Hiram Revels to the U.S. Senate.
The first black senator in American history.
And he actually took the Senate seat that had been famously occupied by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. The symbolism of that is almost too perfect for a novel.
It must have been a moment of absolute euphoria. It really looked like the legal system was actually working. The Constitution had been amended, the rebellious state had submitted to federal authority, and black men were actively governing in the South.
But we know what happened next.
The Redeemers.
Right. This is exactly where the legal illusion collapses.
The white Southern backlash was immediate, and it was incredibly ferocious. You have the rapid rise of the Ku Klux Klan, of course, but you also have these Redeemer governments taking power locally.
And they used paramilitary violence and economic coercion to just systematically strip away everything the 15th Amendment promised.
It perfectly proves that readmission and Reconstruction were remarkably fragile. The federal government eventually just pulled out completely with the Compromise of 1877.
And Mississippi, which had just sworn on February 23rd, 1870 to uphold these civil rights, spent the next century methodically dismantling them piece by piece through Jim Crow.
This is the ultimate lesson of 1870. Law without relentless enforcement is just ink on paper.
Right.
You can have a black senator one day and experience total Democratic disenfranchisement a decade later if you don't retain the actual power to hold those institutions accountable. The law is not a static shield that just protects you automatically. It requires constant maintenance and aggressive defense.
Which sets the stage perfectly for our final historical anchor today. Because if 1870 taught us that rights can be given and then so easily taken away, our final figure teaches us how to grab hold of the institutional gavel so tightly that they can never pry it loose.
We are moving to February 23rd, 1965.
New York City.
Yeah.
On this day, Constance Baker Motley takes the oath of office as the Manhattan Borough President.
She is the first woman and the first black woman to hold that job.
But to really understand why this matters so much to our timeline, we have to look at who she was before she took that oath.
She was the civil rights queen. That was her reputation. She wasn't bred to be a politician. She was a hardcore litigator.
As an attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, she actually wrote the original complaint for Brown v. Board of Education. She represented Martin Luther King Jr.
She won 9 out of the 10 cases she personally argued before the United States Supreme Court. 9 out of 10.
So she essentially spent the 1940s and 50s forcing the American legal system to finally live up to the promises it made back in 1870. She was doing the heavy cleanup work for the ultimate failures of Reconstruction.
Exactly. But what happens on February 23rd, 1965, is that she shifts gears completely. She makes this brilliant strategic pivot. She moves from the judiciary, where she is arguing to power, and steps into the executive branch, where she is finally wielding power.
And borough president isn't just some ceremonial ribbon-cutting role, or at least she certainly didn't treat it like one.
Not at all. She had real statutory control over budget recommendations, land use zoning. She used that executive position to push for urban renewal that actually served Harlem and East Harlem, rather than just displacing the historic residents to build highways. She focused heavily on empowering community planning boards.
It's the practical application of power. Cuffey tried to build a sovereign state in the jungle with a militia. Du Bois theorized about the state and the color line from the university.
And Motley actually ran the state, or at least a massive and influential chunk of New York City.
And she faced immense resistance doing it. We have to remember she was navigating the deeply entrenched male-dominated world of New York City machine politics.
But she used her brilliant legal mind to just outmaneuver them at every turn. She understood the bylaws and the city charter better than the Old Boys Network did. They couldn't intimidate her because she knew the rules better than they did.
There's also a really beautiful symmetry to her later career that ties this all together. After serving as borough president, she became a federal judge. She literally became the very institution she used to argue in front of.
She really embodies the ultimate synthesis of all these dates we've discussed today. She has the unyielding fighting spirit of 1763 Berbice. She has the profound intellectual rigor of 1868 with Du Bois, and she personally redeems the broken legal promises of 1870 Mississippi.
She closes the gap between freedom on paper and power in practice.
She absolutely does. It's incredible when you line them up sequentially like this. 1763, 1854, 1868, 1870, 1965.
That's a curriculum.
It really is. It teaches us that liberation isn't just a straight upward line of progress. It is a complex cycle of physical revolt, severe political backlash, intellectual reframing, and finally, institutional capture.
And it reminds us that power is rarely, if ever, just given to you out of the goodness of an empire's heart. In Berbice, they had to take it by force. In the Orange Free State, the settlers took it specifically to exclude others. In Mississippi, it was granted conditionally and then violently stolen back.
And with Motley, it was earned through decades of grueling tactical warfare in the courts and at the ballot box.
So as we wrap up this deep dive today, I want to go back to that feeling of looking at your calendar this morning, February 23rd. To most people, walking around, it's just a regular Monday.
But if you know how to read the historical code, it's a manual on how to build a revolution.
That is exactly the thought I want to leave you with today. History isn't just a dry list of things that happened a long time ago. It's an intricate pattern of cause and effect that is still vibrating under our feet right now. If just one day, February 23rd, contains this much density, this much struggle and triumph, what other hidden genealogies are sitting right there in the other 364 squares of your year?
You just have to be willing to dig a little deeper to find them.
Thanks for digging with us. We will see you on the next deep dive.